I'm Maris Keaton, 70 years old this spring, though most days I feel older. Not in body arthritis is kind enough to visit only on damp mornings, but in spirit. Years of bending my will around other people's needs will do that to a woman. The chapel at St. Philip's smells faintly of lilies and floor wax. Candles flicker against the old brick walls, and I can hear the hush of Charleston outside. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone. Inside, my family prepares for a funeral as if it were a business reception. My son, Soren, stands near the altar, checking his watch while issuing quiet orders to the ushers. My daughter, Brielle, supervises the caterers setting up in the adjoining hall, her voice crisp, professional, her father's voice. I move between pews, placing folded service programs where the guests will find them, one by one. No one asked me to do it. I simply know what needs to be done. It's how I've survived in this family, by anticipating everyone but myself. 30 years of breakfasts at dawn, of ironed shirts and polished shoes, of Mom. Could you whispered like command? When Graham was alive, I told myself it was love that kept me working. Love, and the hope that my children would someday see me as something more than the woman who made their lives easy. The organ begins its low prelude. A few guests glance my way, but quickly look past me, toward the front row where Soren and Brielle sit. I take the seat in the last pew. It seems fitting. Elliot Crane, our family lawyer, slides in beside me. His suit smells faintly of tobacco and starch, the same since the day he handled our first mortgage papers. His voice drops to a whisper. Maris, he says, eyes on the altar. When the service ends, don't leave yet. Your husband left a sealed letter for you, and a second will. For a heartbeat, the air leaves my lungs. Graham and I never spoke of wills after the last revision 15 years ago. I nod, though my hands tremble against the folded program. As the choir begins, Abide with me, I stare at the flickering candles, wondering what Graham left unsaid and why he waited until now to say it. The service blurred into hours of polite condolences and meaningless words. By the time the last guest had drifted away, I stood beside the flower arrangements. Hollow from too much composure, Elliot waited near the exit, his expression grave but gentle. Let me drive you home, he said, offering his arm the way Graham used to. I didn't argue. The ride to the house was quiet, Charleston's live oaks bending in the wind like tired mourners. Inside, the rooms felt too clean, too still. Graham's study smelled faintly of cedar and the pipe tobacco he'd quit years ago. Elliot reached into his briefcase and placed a thick envelope on the desk. He filed a confidential revision with me 3 months ago, he said. A full restructuring of the estate. He wanted you to read this privately. I traced the handwriting on the envelope, Maris in his familiar, deliberate script. My throat tightened. Elliot lingered just long enough to ask if I'd be all right. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. When the door closed behind him, the silence felt immense. The letter inside was written on our old stationery from the early days of Keaton Freight, the company we built together. Graham's handwriting wavered more than I remembered, but his tone was unmistakable. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I know how much I've left you alone in this house. How often I mistook gratitude for love. I see now that Soren and Brielle have taken more than they've given. I've watched it too long. Excusing it as ambition, it was greed, and I allowed it. I pressed my hand to my mouth. His words blurred as tears gathered. All company stock, the property, the accounts, everything is now in your trust. The total is near $91 million. You owe them nothing. I finally see what I should have protected all along you. The paper trembled between my fingers. For the first time that day, I let myself cry, not for the man I'd lost, but for the years I had spent believing he hadn't seen me at all. Morning light slipped through the shutters, pale and uninvited. I hadn't slept much after reading Graham's letter. It lay open on the kitchen table beside a cold cup of tea, the edges already softening from the humidity. For hours, I'd stared at it, torn between gratitude and disbelief. But when the shock settled, another feeling took its place: unease. I began moving through the house, almost without thinking. The habit of tidying was hard to break. Cleaning had always been my way of thinking. In the drawer by the pantry, beneath old warranties and spare batteries, I found a set of keys I didn't recognize. 4 of them, neatly labeled on a plastic tag, "Maid." The word hit me harder than I expected. Soren must have made these copies. He'd handled the security system updates years ago. He'd called me that once, jokingly, after I reminded him to pick up after himself. "You're the best maid we've ever had, Mom," he'd laughed. I'd pretended not to mind. I took the keys to the kitchen counter, staring at them as if they might confess something. Then I noticed the tablet on the charging stand. Graham and I had shared access to the family accounts, though I rarely looked. I tapped through the familiar banking app. My name appeared beside his, the balance far larger than I'd ever dared to imagine. But deeper in the history, numbers began to shift. Transfers, withdrawals, cash advances, dates aligned with Soren's startup launch, his green freight project that had quietly collapsed last year. Dozens of small transfers, hidden in maintenance categories. Then Brielle's pattern appeared: beauty purchases, flights, and something labeled brand payments, all charged to a card linked to my household account. I closed the tablet slowly, my reflection flickering on the dark screen. My children hadn't just overlooked me, they'd used me. Every polite dismissal, every patronizing smile had been built on quiet theft. The keys still lay on the counter, their metal cold against my palm. I gathered them into a drawer, locked it, and for the first time in years, pocketed the only key that truly mattered mine. 3 days later, I walked into Elliot Crane's office on Broad Street, the air heavy with humidity and perfume from the magnolia trees outside. Soren and Brielle were already there, sitting side by side at the polished conference table. They didn't look at me when I entered. Elliot greeted us with his usual restraint, the kind that could calm a courtroom or startle it into silence. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding a folder toward me. "This is the finalized probate file. Your husband's will was legally amended and notarized in my presence." I'll read it aloud for the record. The words flowed like cold water. Maris Elaine Keaton, sole trustee and beneficiary. The rest went to a charitable trust college scholarships for maritime families, activated only after my death. Nothing immediate for the children. Brielle's chair scraped back before Elliot even finished. "You expect me to believe this," she said, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Dad would never freeze us out like that. Mom must have talked him into it." Soren leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "When did you start meeting privately with him? Before he died? Or after you realized we'd built this company for him?" I tried to answer, but my voice caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. Graham had made his choice. It wasn't mine to defend. Elliot stepped in before I could speak. "Mr. Keaton signed of his own volition. I have the witnesses and digital records." Brielle gathered her bag and stormed out, perfume trailing after her like smoke. Soren stayed just long enough to mutter, "You'll regret this," before slamming the door behind him. Elliot exhaled slowly. "They'll contest. Maris, it's what families do when love meets money. Be ready for a fight." Elliot called 2 mornings later, his tone clipped but careful. "Maris, I'd like you to meet someone who can help us verify certain transactions," he said. That afternoon, I found myself in his office again, across from a woman with alert gray eyes and a quiet steadiness that reminded me of Graham's sister. "This is Rhea Donnelly," Elliot said. "She's a forensic accountant." Rhea nodded politely and spread a folder across the table. "I've been reviewing recent activity tied to Keaton Freight's family accounts," she said. "Some of it is troubling." She turned the pages slowly, letting me see rather than telling me what she'd found. There it was, an unsigned draft of a power of attorney naming Soren as my representative, dated just 6 weeks before Graham's death. Beneath it, several requests for wire transfers marked urgent, equipment liquidation. My name appeared as the authorizing party. "That signature isn't mine," I said, my throat tightening. "I know," she replied. "It was traced digitally from old documents. Whoever did this had access to archived files." Further down the report, Rhea showed a chain of emails between Brielle and Graham's subject lines about brand partnerships and advance allowances. She'd pressured him for funds to maintain family image while he was in the hospital. He'd never responded. I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying the tremor there. For years, I'd told myself their entitlement came from youth, not malice. But now, the evidence sat between us in black ink and timestamps. Elliot handed me a pen. "We can request a restraining order, financial, not physical. It will freeze access to your trust until this is resolved." I signed the forms without hesitation. When I looked up again, Rhea was studying me quietly. "You're calmer than most," she said softly. "Calm," I answered. "Folding the papers is what comes after denial." I spent the morning setting the table as if it were any other Sunday linen napkins. The chipped blue plates Graham had always favored, a roast in the oven that filled the house with warmth I no longer felt. By dusk, the kitchen gleamed, and every chair was in place except the one I had deliberately left empty, Graham's. Soren arrived first, smelling faintly of cologne and impatience. Brielle followed, phone in hand, eyes red but dry. Neither greeted me with a hug. They sat across from each other, rigid as strangers at a negotiation. "I asked you here," I began, "because this can't go on through lawyers." Soren leaned back. "Then stop hiding behind them." I ignored the jab. "You both made mistakes. So did I. By letting you believe love came without limits. I'm willing to set up a modest monthly allowance for education, housing, or therapy, but only if you each sign a financial counseling agreement and acknowledge the harm you've done." Brielle let out a low laugh. "You think you can buy forgiveness with conditions?" "This isn't about forgiveness," I said. "It's about responsibility." Soren's jaw tightened. "You're punishing us for Dad's decision. That money was meant for the family." "It is for the family," I answered, my voice steady. I just no longer define that word by entitlement. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock over the sink ticked louder than it should have. Then Brielle pushed her chair back. "If this is your idea of peace, you can keep it." She grabbed her coat and left. Soren lingered a moment longer, his expression hard. "You'll regret cutting us out," he said quietly, before walking into the dark. The silence that followed was almost tender. I looked at their untouched plates, the steam fading from the roast, and whispered to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Then we're done, confusing love with access." The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust. Morning light slanted through tall windows, cutting bright lines across the polished floor. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Elliot, hands clasped tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Soren and Brielle faced forward, their lawyer whispering to them as though this were a simple business dispute and not the collapse of a family. Judge Hanley entered without ceremony, robes sweeping as she took her seat. Keaton versus Keaton, she read, glancing over her glasses. Petition to contest the validity of the last will and testament of Graham M. Keaton. Elliot rose with quiet authority. Your Honor, the documents in question were executed properly, witnessed, and filed by this office. The opposing party has offered no evidence of coercion or mental incompetence. The judge nodded, flipping through the file. Mr. Soren Keaton, she said, you allege undue influence by your mother. Soren stood. His voice trembled despite the practiced calm. My father was sick. She isolated him. Everything changed after she got involved with his finances. Elliot handed over Rhea Donnelly's report. On the contrary, Your Honor, the records show repeated withdrawals from Mrs. Keaton's accounts matching Mr. Keaton's failed ventures, as well as forged authorizations bearing her signature. That is not isolation. That is exploitation. The courtroom fell into an awful, echoing silence. The judge's eyes softened as she turned toward me. Mrs. Keaton, I'm sorry you had to endure this. Then, to the room at large, the will stands. The trust remains under Mrs. Keaton's sole authority. I also note potential indicators of elder financial abuse in prior transactions. This court will refer those findings to the appropriate agency. Soren's jaw tightened. A sound, half growl, half sob, escaped him. Brielle reached for his arm, but he pulled away. Her mascara streaked downward, black lines on porcelain skin. Elliot leaned toward me, his voice low but steady. It's over. Maris, you're free to choose peace now. Outside. The sun was blinding. The air smelled of salt and magnolia. Reporters waited on the steps, but I walked past them without a word. Justice had come, quiet and cold like morning light through old glass. The locksmith came at noon, his truck humming softly in the driveway beneath the oaks. I watched from the porch as he worked steady hands. Polite silence. The faint clink of new brass replacing the old. When he finished, he handed me a neat ring of keys, each one gleaming in the sun. They felt heavier than I expected, as if they carried more than metal. Inside, the house smelled of primer and citrus cleaner. Graham's office, once dark wood and shadow, was now bright with pale sage walls and a new rug that caught the afternoon light. I'd cleared his ledgers and blueprints, boxing them with care for donation to the Maritime Museum. In their place sat a pair of armchairs, a reading lamp, and a shelf of books I'd chosen for no one's taste but my own. Odette Vale arrived the next morning, a tall woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. I don't live in, she said, but I do thorough work. Perfect, I replied, handing her a written contract that included vacation pay, health coverage, and a schedule that ended before dusk. Her surprise melted into a smile. Most people don't offer this. I'm not most people, I said simply. After she left, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator door. The faded to-do list Brielle had taped there years ago was still hanging my own handwriting beneath her neat commands. Groceries, laundry, guest linens. I peeled it off slowly, the tape lifting with a faint sigh, and dropped it into the trash. The empty surface shone under the afternoon light. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. Each room breathed differently, softer somehow, as if it had been waiting for this moment, too. I sat in the new reading chair, the sun warming my knees, and realized I was no longer keeping a home for others. I was finally living in mine. The press conference was held in the courtyard of the Charleston Maritime Museum, beneath the same live oaks where Graham once gave safety lectures to his crew. This time, though, the microphone stood before me. Elliot adjusted my notes, his calm professionalism anchoring me. Beside him, Ria held the foundation's official paperwork, stamped, notarized. Final. You don't have to read it word for word, she murmured. Just speak like you did in your kitchen that day. I smiled faintly. That went so well, I said dryly, earning a quiet laugh from her. When I stepped to the podium, the murmurs of Charleston society softened into a hush. I cleared my throat and began. My husband built his life on the water. I built mine, making sure the people he employed were seen and heard. Today, in both our names, I want that work to continue. The plan was simple, but deliberate. 50% of the estate would fund scholarships for children of port workers, those who kept the city alive long after the boardrooms closed. 25% would remain in my living trust, ensuring independence without extravagance. And the final quarter, a conditional family fund, would be available only after verified counseling and debt rehabilitation. I saw a few raised brows at that. Let them whisper. For once, I didn't flinch from the weight of my choices. Afterward, the local paper called it a graceful assertion of integrity. Donations followed. So did silence from my children. That evening, I sat on my porch overlooking the harbor, a soft breeze carrying the scent of salt and gardenia. Ria had joined me for tea. You know, she said, most people build walls after what you've endured. You built something that breathes. I watched a tugboat push through the twilight, its wake glimmering like a signature across the water. Graham used to say, I whispered, legacy isn't what you leave, it's what you repair. And for the first time, I believed him. Spring crept quietly into Charleston, soft and forgiving. The azaleas along the walkway had returned to bloom, and the house felt lighter somehow, as if it too had learned to exhale. One morning, Odette handed me 2 envelopes while setting down the mail tray. The first bore Soren's handwriting stiff, deliberate, almost formal. Inside was a single page and a bank statement showing wire transfers repaying the loans he'd taken under my name. A note beneath the figures read, for once, I wanted to fix something instead of breaking it. The second envelope was softer, addressed in looping cursive with no return address. I knew the handwriting instantly. Brielle's letter was short, written in smudged ink. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I finally understand what I mistook for control was your love trying to protect us. I'm sorry. I folded the letter gently and placed it beside Graham's, both tucked into the same wooden box. Some debts, I thought, are repaid in silence. 2 weeks later, the Graham and Maris Keaton Foundation hosted its first scholarship breakfast in the courtyard of the Maritime Museum. 12 students, dressed nervously in borrowed jackets and bright smiles, received their awards. Elliot spoke briefly about responsibility. Ria managed the logistics with her usual precision. When it was my turn, I simply thanked them for reminding me what rebuilding looks like. After the ceremony, I returned home to the sound of wind chimes on the porch strings of Graham's old warehouse keys, polished to silver, swaying against the afternoon breeze. They sang softly, not mournfully but alive, their clinking a kind of quiet blessing. I sat with a cup of tea, watching sunlight flicker on the harbor through the live oaks. The house no longer felt like a museum of mistakes. It breathed again, each corner touched by something earned, something right. Love had built this home, but boundaries hard-won and steadfast had kept it standing. The chimes sang again, bright and certain, and I let the sound fill the space that used to ache.